The air in Sector 88 did not move. It stagnated, heavy with the metallic tang of recycled sweat and the burnt almond scent of failing atmospheric scrubbers. Kalen Voss wiped a streak of blackened lubricant across his brow, leaving a dark smear that matched the shadows beneath his eyes. He was hunched inside the bypass manifold of a primary oxygen line, his wrench glowing a dull, heated orange as it fought a stubborn, rusted bolt. If this line blew, 3,000 laborers in the lower spire would start breathing vacuum within 6 minutes. Management would call it a tragic industrial oversight. Kalen called it Tuesday. Voss, a voice crackled through his inner ear comm, gravelly and thin. You have a visitor at the airlock. Kalen didn't look up. His knuckles were white against the wrench. I'm busy, Arlo. Unless the visitor is bringing a replacement magnetic bearing for this turbine, tell them to rot. It is a gold-tier courier, Kalen. High spire, private encryption. Kalen froze. The bolt gave way with a screech that vibrated through his teeth, but he didn't feel the relief. High spire residents didn't visit Sector 88 unless they wanted to buy a soul or sell a lie. He crawled out of the vent, his knees popping like dry twigs. Standing by the rusted airlock was a man who looked like he had been rendered in high definition against a low-resolution world. He wore a suit of shifting liquid silk that shimmered with deep indigo hues, his skin so clean it looked translucent. He stood amidst the grime of the maintenance deck with an expression of clinical detachment, as if he were observing a petri dish. Kalen Voss, the man said. It wasn't a question. That is the name on the debt register, Kalen grunted, tossing his wrench into a bucket of solvent. Who's asking? My employer prefers anonymity for the initial stage of the transaction. The courier held out a small hexagonal data prism. He wishes to offer you a contract, 1 night's work, 50,000 credits. Kalen's heart did a slow, painful roll in his chest. 50,000. That was 4 cycles of the life support lease for Alara. It was the difference between her breathing and her becoming part of the station's recycled organic matter. What's the catch? Kalen asked, his voice rasping. I don't kill people. My tools are for fixing, not breaking. No violence is required, the courier said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. On the contrary, we require social failure. You have been selected for your authentic lack of refinement. You are to attend a dinner at the Event Horizon tonight. You will be provided with a companion. Your job is to ensure she never wishes to see a human male ever again. Kalen stared at the prism. He looked at his scarred hands, the permanent oil stains under his nails, and then he thought of the quiet hum of the stasis cradle in his small apartment, where Alara lay trapped in a dreamless sleep. She is Glimmerkin, the courier added, a ward of Thorn Dynamics. Be dull, be offensive, be the grease monkey they expect you to be. Kalen reached out and took the prism, the cold light of the data chip reflected in his dark eyes. Tell your boss I'm expensive, but I'm very good at being a disappointment. The Event Horizon was a restaurant built on a lie. It sat at the absolute apex of Aetherius Spires, a circular dome of hypercarbon glass that offered a 360-degree view of the Vexus 9 gas giant. From this height, the violent storms below looked like beautiful ripples of velvet. You couldn't see the lightning that tore through the lower spires. You couldn't hear the screams of the turbines. Kalen felt like a virus in a clean room. He wore a borrowed suit that hummed with a cheap vibrating fit sensor, trying to compress his broad shoulders into a silhouette that wasn't meant for manual labor. The Maitre d', a synthetic with a face of polished porcelain, had looked at Kalen's hands for a full 3 seconds before leading him to the table. Table 12, positioned at the very edge of the glass floor. Looking down was like falling into a purple abyss. Kalen kept his eyes on the tablecloth. It was made of genuine woven silk, a material he had only seen in digital catalogs. She was already there. The data prism had said she was a Glimmerkin, but it hadn't prepared him for the luminescence. Lyra sat with a posture that was both fragile and regal. Her skin held a faint golden glow, as if she had swallowed a star. Her hair wasn't hair at all, but a cascade of fiber optic strands that shifted from soft white to pale blue as she breathed. She was small, barely reaching Kalen's chest if they were standing, but the air around her felt charged, heavy with a silent resonance. You are late, she said. Her voice didn't just strike the ear, it vibrated in the bones of the skull. Kalen pulled out the chair with a deliberate, noisy scrape. He sat down heavily, leaning his elbows on the silk. The fit sensor in his suit let out a tiny, Protestant beep. Traffic in the vents was a nightmare, Kalen said, his voice loud and rough. Had to kick a couple of vermin out of the way. You the alien? Lyra didn't flinch. She watched him with eyes that were solid pools of liquid emerald, lacking pupils or whites. She looked at his grease-stained cuticles, the way he gripped the silver fork as if it were a pry bar. I am Lyra, she said softly, and you are a man who is trying very hard to be unpleasant. It is a fascinating performance. Kalen felt a prickle of sweat at his hairline. He was supposed to talk about atmospheric pressure or the history of bolt tensioning for 2 hours. He was supposed to be the authentic lack of refinement that Valerius Thorn wanted. Performance, he scoffed, waving a hand dismissively at the astronomical view. Look, sweetheart, I'm here for the food. I heard they serve real protein up here, not the algae paste we get in the pits. You want to order, or are you going to keep staring at me like I'm a malfunctioning droid? Lyra leaned forward. As she moved, the golden dust on her skin shimmered. I can feel the rhythm of this station, Kalen Voss. I can feel the friction in the gears and the tension in the soles. Your rhythm is dissonant. You are vibrating at a frequency of profound terror. Kalen froze. The fork clattered against the fine china. The mask he had spent the last hour preparing cracked. Why are you afraid, she whispered. Why did a man who smells of heavy oil and honest work come to the highest point of the spires to pretend he is a fool? Kalen looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see a glimmerkin or a political ward. He saw someone who was just as trapped as he was, caged in light while he was caged in darkness. Because, Kalen said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl, honesty doesn't pay for life support leases. Lyra's emerald eyes softened. She reached across the table, her small, glowing hand hovering just inches from his scarred fingers. Then stop acting, Kalen Voss, she said. Valerius Thorn has already paid for the dinner. Let us use this hour to be something more than his property. Tell me about the girl in the cradle. Kalen felt the world tilt. The glass floor beneath him felt solid for the very first time. He realized then that he wasn't there to ruin a date. He was there to be saved. The silence between them at table 12 was not empty. It was pressurized, a vacuum waiting for a single crack to implode. Kalen Voss stared at his hands, those calloused, oil-etched tools that had no business touching silk. He could feel the eyes of the high-spire elite on his back, 1,000 invisible needles of judgment. But more than that, he felt Lyra. Her glow was not just light, it was a frequency, a low-level thrum that seemed to vibrate against his own pulse. You are waiting for me to be insulted, Lyra said, her voice like the chime of crystal against glass. You are waiting for me to stand up, call for the porcelain steward, and have you removed so you can go back to your sector with your pockets full of Thorn's credits. Kalen finally looked up. The emerald depth of her eyes was terrifying. There was no judgment there, only an exhausted clarity. She looked like someone who had watched the same play 1,000 times and finally decided to speak to the actor. It's a simple job, Lyra, Kalen said, his voice dropping the forced gruffness. He sounded tired, even to his own ears. Simple jobs are rare in the lower spires. Usually I'm fighting a gas leak or a failing magnetic seal. I don't usually get paid to sit in a chair and eat things I can't pronounce. And yet you are failing at it, she noted, a small, sad smile tugging at her iridescent lips. You are being honest. Honesty is the one thing Valerius Thorn did not pay you for. He paid for a caricature, a dirty, boorish, uneducated grunt from the grease pits to prove to me that the world outside his protection is ugly and incompatible with my nature. Kalen leaned back, the cheap fit sensors in his borrowed jacket whining in protest. Why? Why go to all this trouble? If he's your patron, why does he care who you date? Lyra looked out at the churning violet clouds of Vexus 9. Her fiber-optic hair shifted into a deep, mourning violet. Because I am a glimmer-kin, Kalen. To your people, we are beautiful anomalies. To Thorn Dynamics, we are biological resonators. My skin, my nerves, my very thoughts are tuned to the station's frequency. I am the reason the harmonization signal remains stable. I am the bridge between the machine and the soul. Kalen's mechanical mind started clicking. He knew the station's grid. He knew the dirge crystals that hummed in the central spires, broadcasting the subliminal waves that kept the population from rioting over the gravity tax. He had always assumed it was pure tech. You're the antenna, Kalen whispered, the horror of it settling in his gut. I am the filter, she corrected. If I am lonely, the station feels a dull ache. If I am angry, the turbines grind. Valerius wants me isolated. He wants me to believe that I am a goddess in a cage because the alternative is to realize I am a prisoner in a circuit board. This date was a test of my resolve. He wanted me to seek connection and find only grease. Kalen felt a sudden sharp spike of shame. He was the grease. He was the weapon chosen to break a woman's hope so she would go back to being a component in a corporate machine. He thought of Ilara, lying in her cradle 3,000 meters below their feet. He was trying to save his sister by helping Thorn destroy Lyra. The 50,000 credits, Kalen said, his voice barely audible over the soft orchestral hum of the restaurant. My sister, Ilara, she has neural decay, stage 4, the station's broadcast, the very signal you helped stabilize. It's what's killing her. The doctors say her brain can't handle the resonance. She needs a cortex cradle to keep her neural pathways from fraying into nothing. Lyra's glow flared, a brilliant, sympathetic gold that momentarily outshone the candles on the table. The irony is a jagged thing, is it not? You were hired to humiliate the woman who amplifies the very sound that is silencing your sister. Kalen gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. I didn't know. I just knew the credit prism was enough to keep her plugged in for another year. I'm a mechanic, Lyra. I fix what's in front of me. I don't look at the big picture. The big picture is for people who can afford the view. Then look at me, Kalen Voss, Lyra commanded. He looked. He didn't see an alien. He didn't see a ward of the state. He saw a living, breathing entity that was being harvested for her essence. Valerius is watching us, she said, her eyes scanning the ceiling where hidden sensors recorded every micro-expression. If we leave now, you don't get your credits, and I get sent to the loom. The loom? Kalen asked. Permanent integration, she said, and for the first time, her voice trembled. They will remove the need for my physical form. They will stitch my consciousness directly into the station's core. I will become the etheric spires, and I will never be alone, yet I will never be myself again. Kalen felt a cold sweat break out across his back. He knew what he had to do. The logical, pragmatic part of him, the part that survived the gas leaks and the pressure drops, told him to stay, finish the act, take the money, and save Ilara. But the part of him that still remembered his father's voice, a man who had died in a hull breach so others could live, couldn't sit still. We're leaving, Kalen said, standing up. You will lose everything, Lyra warned, though she too was rising from her chair. I've spent my whole life fixing things for Thorn, Kalen said, reaching out his hand. He didn't care about the grease anymore. He didn't care about the suit. For once, I'm going to break something. Lyra looked at his hand, scarred, rough, and honest. She didn't hesitate. She placed her glowing fingers in his palm. The contact was like a low-voltage shock, a spark of pure, unadulterated reality in a room full of gilded illusions. Where are we going, she asked. To the pits, Kalen said. If you're going to be a bridge, you should see what you're crossing. They walked out of the event horizon, past the stunned porcelain stewards and the whispering aristocrats. Kalen didn't head for the maglev elevators. Thorn would have those locked down in seconds. Instead, he led her toward a service hatch marked with the jagged seal of the Maintenance Guild. Kalen pulled a heavy master key from his belt, a tool he had spent 3 months' salary on. He jammed it into the lock and twisted. The heavy carbon steel door hissed open, revealing a dark, vertical shaft filled with the rhythmic thudding of the station's heart. It's a long way down, Kalen said, looking at Lyra's white robes. And it's not clean. I have spent my life in a room of light, Kalen, Lyra said, stepping into the dark. I think I am ready for the shadows. The descent was a masterclass in the station's cruelty. As they moved down through the umbilical levels, the air changed. The genetically patented lavender scent of the high spire evaporated, replaced by the heavy, humid smell of recycled oxygen, ozone, and the metallic tang of industrial coolant. Gravity, too, became an adversary. Aetherius spires operated on a subscription-based gravity grid. In the upper spires, the pull was a perfect, comfortable 1.0 G. But as Kalen and Lyra climbed down the service ladders, the fluctuations began. In Sector 40, the gravity dropped to a sickening 0.4 G, making every step a floating struggle. By Sector 60, it spiked to 1.5 G, pulling at Lyra's lungs and making her glow flicker with the effort of movement. "Hold on to the rail," Kalen grunted, his hand firmly on the small of her back to steady her. "The subgrids are struggling. Thorne's been diverting power to the luxury liners docking at the apex. The lower spires always take the hit first." "Why do they stay?" Lyra asked, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "If the air is thin and the weight is heavy, why not leave?" "Leave to where?" Kalen asked, his voice echoing in the metallic throat of the shaft. "Vexus 9 is a gas giant. There's nothing down there but crushing pressure and ammonia storms. The spires are the only life in the sector. You either pay the tax and breathe, or you stop paying and become part of the history." They reached the junction for Sector 88. Kalen kicked open a rusted ventilation grate and climbed through, helping Lyra down into a narrow, dimly lit corridor. This was the world of the grease monkeys. The walls were a patchwork of exposed wiring and leaking pipes, held together by sheer willpower and layers of industrial sealant. The silence of the upper spire was gone. Here the station screamed. The constant whine of high-pressure turbines and the rhythmic hammering of the cargo loaders created a cacophony that felt like a physical weight. Lyra stumbled, her hand going to the wall. Her golden skin seemed to dim in the harsh, flickering yellow light of the sodium lamps. "The resonance," she whispered. It's jagged here." "That's the reality," Kalen said, leading her toward a cluster of modular housing units. No filters, no harmonies. Just the raw sound of survival. They were met by a woman with a shock of neon blue hair and eyes that had seen too many hull breaches. She was holding a diagnostic scanner like a weapon. Juno Hale was the closest thing Kalen had to a friend, the lead engineer for the Sector 88 maintenance crew, and the only person Kalen trusted with his secrets. "Voss?" Juno stared at Kalen, then her eyes moved to the glowing woman beside him. Her jaw dropped. "Tell me you didn't. Tell me you didn't kidnap a Glimmerkin." "She's not a kidnap, Juno. She's a guest," Kalen said, walking past her toward the back of the workshop. "Is the cradle stable?" Juno followed them, her boots clanking on the metal floor. "Stable as it can be on a failing grid. We had a brownout an hour ago. I had to bypass the main breaker to keep her oxygenated. But Kalen, if the enforcers find her here—" "They won't," Kalen said. But he knew he was lying. Thorne would be tracing Lyra's biological signature. It was only a matter of time. He stopped in front of a small, cramped room partitioned off with heavy lead-lined curtains. He pulled the fabric aside, revealing a small, sterile oasis in the middle of the grime. In the center of the room was a Cortex cradle, a sleek white pod that looked like a coffin made of light. Inside, a young girl, no more than 12 years old, lay perfectly still. Her hair was the same dark shade as Kalen's, but her skin was a translucent, sickly pale. Fine silver wires ran from the base of the cradle into the ports behind her ears. "Elara," Kalen whispered. Lyra stepped forward, her glow softening into a gentle, pulsating amber. She approached the cradle with a reverence that made Juno go silent. She placed her hand on the glass surface of the pod. "She is not just sick, Kalen," Lyra said, her eyes welling with emerald light. "She is trying to harmonize." "What?" Kalen asked, stepping closer. "She's human. She's not like you. The station's signal, the dirge crystals. They aren't just for crowd control," Lyra said, her voice trembling. "They are a broadcast of a singular, artificial emotion, obedience. But Alara's mind is too resonant. She is fighting the signal. Her brain is trying to create its own melody to drown out Thorne's noise. The decay isn't a disease. It's a war." Kalen looked at his sister. He had spent years thinking her body was failing her. Now he realized her mind was simply too strong to be broken by the station's broadcast. She was a rebel in a coma. "Can you help her?" Kalen asked, his voice breaking. Lyra looked at the girl, then at the heavy, pulsing dirge crystal that sat on a shelf in the corner of the workshop. a piece of contraband Kalen had scavenged months ago to study. I can show her how to sing, Lyra said. But if I do, the station will hear us. Thorne will know exactly where we are. Kalen looked at Juno, who was already checking the charge on her pulse welder. He looked at the rusted walls of Sector 88, at the flickering lights, and at the sister he had sacrificed his pride to protect. Courage, his father used to say, wasn't about not being afraid. It was about what you did when the fear was screaming in your ears. Do it, Kalen said. Lyra closed her eyes. Her glow began to expand, not outward like a lamp, but inward, becoming a concentrated, blinding point of light. She leaned her forehead against the glass of the cradle. The air in the workshop began to hum. The tools on the benches started to vibrate. The low, mournful drone of the station's background noise began to shift, to warp, as Lyra's frequency began to entwine with Alara's silent struggle. Suddenly, the workshop was filled with a sound Kalen had never heard before. It wasn't music, and it wasn't noise. It was a clear, soaring note that cut through the grime and the static of the spires. It was the sound of a choice. In the cradle, Alara's fingers twitched. Her eyelids fluttered. But high above them, in the penthouse of Thorne Dynamics, the monitors flared red. Valerius Thorne stood at his window, looking down at the dark, sprawling mass of the spires. He could feel it in his teeth, a discordance, a glitch in his perfect symphony. "Find them," Thorne said to the shadow standing behind him, "and bring me the mechanic's head." Down in Sector 88, Kalen Voss picked up his wrench. He was terrified. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. But as he looked at Lyra and his sister, connected by a thread of light, he realized he wasn't a Shiwang disappointment anymore. He was a guardian. "We've got company coming," Kalen said to Juno. "Lock the airlocks. We're going to have to fix this the hard way." Juno grinned, a sharp, dangerous expression. "I've been waiting for a reason to blow the breakers on this whole sector." The note continued to soar, a small, fragile light in the heart of a Titan's darkness. The war for Aethera's spires had begun, not with an explosion, but with a song. The darkness of Sector 88 was never a true black. It was a murky, vibrating charcoal, illuminated by the dying embers of neon signs and the orange glow of industrial furnaces that never slept. In Kalen's workshop, that darkness was being pushed back by something impossible, a soft, rhythmic pulsing of emerald and gold. Lyra remained bent over Alara's stasis cradle. Her hands didn't touch the glass anymore. They hovered a fraction of an inch above it, her fingers twitching in a complex, silent choreography. Every time her glow flared, Alara's biometrics on the cracked monitor spiked in response. "She's talking to her," Juno whispered, standing by the heavy blast door with a modified pulse rifle strapped to her shoulder. "I've seen some strange tech in my time, Voss. But this is ghost work." "It's resonance," Kalen replied, though he didn't really understand the difference. He was busy at a workbench, his hands moving with frantic mechanical precision. He was assembling what he called a static shield, a crude array of copper coils and scavenged dirge crystal shards designed to create a localized dead zone. If Thorne's enforcers used the station's frequency to track them, this might buy them a few minutes of invisibility. Suddenly, the workshop's lights didn't just flicker, they died. The hum of the ventilation scrubbers groaned into a halt. The silence that followed was terrifying, a heavy vacuum that made Kalen's ears pop. Then the emergency red strobes began to pulse, bathing the room in the color of a fresh wound. "He's here," Lyra said. Her voice wasn't a chime anymore. It was a flat, resonant tone that carried a vibration of pure dread. A voice, cold and amplified, bled through the workshop's comm unit, overriding the internal privacy locks. "Mr. Voss," the voice of Valerius Thorne said, sounding as clear as if he were standing in the room, "I must admit I am disappointed. I had calculated your desperation, but I had underestimated your capacity for irrationality. You are currently standing in a sector that exists solely because I allow it to. Every breath you take is a line item on my balance sheet." Kalen didn't answer. He jammed a power cell into the static shield. The device let out a low, angry buzz. "You are protecting a woman who is not yours to protect, and a sister who is already a ghost," Thorne continued. "Let us be pragmatic. The Glimmerkin is a corporate asset. Her absence is currently costing Thorne Dynamics 3 million credits per hour in station stability. Return her to the airlock, and I will not only forgive your debt, I will personally oversee Alara's transition to the High Spire Medical Wing. She will have the best surgeons, the finest tech. She will live, Kalen. Kalen looked at the cradle. He looked at Alara's pale, peaceful face. For a heartbeat, his resolve wavered. It was the bargain he had prayed for every night for 5 years. One choice, one betrayal, and the crushing weight on his chest would be gone. Kalen, Juno hissed, her eyes wide. Voss, look at the screen. Kalen turned. The monitor on the Cortex cradle was glitching. The words unauthorized access were flashing in red. Thorn wasn't just talking. He was already inside the cradle's software. I am adjusting the oxygen flow in the cradle, Kalen, Thorn said, his voice regaining its polite, clinical tone. It is currently at 60%. It will drop by 10% every minute you remain silent. I do not wish to kill the girl. She is, after all, a very interesting specimen, but assets must be protected, and the Glimmerkin is the primary priority. Kalen's hands began to shake. The fear he had felt at the restaurant was nothing compared to this. This was a cold, suffocating terror that paralyzed his lungs. He looked at Lyra. She was looking back at him, her emerald eyes filled with a terrifying understanding. She didn't plead. She didn't beg for her life. She simply waited for his choice. He's lying, Kalen, Lyra whispered. If you give me back, he will still cleanse the sector. He cannot let the station know that a mechanic and a Glimmerkin defied him. He needs to erase the discordance. Kalen turned to the comm unit. He reached for the transmit button. His finger hovered over it. His mind screamed at him to say the words, "Take her. Just save my sister." But then he looked at his wrench lying on the table. He thought about the turbines he fixed, the pipes he welded. He fixed things so they worked the way they were supposed to. He didn't break things to make his life easier. Thorn, Kalen said, his voice raspy but firm. Yes, Mr. Voss. You don't understand how things work down here, Kalen said. You think everything is a trade, a debt, a credit prism. But when a machine is under too much pressure, it doesn't just stop, it explodes. Kalen slammed his hand down, not on the transmit button, but on the static shield's activation switch. A wall of white noise erupted from the device. The red emergency strobes shattered. The comm unit screamed with feedback before dying into static. The air in the room felt thick, like wading through invisible wool. Thorn was cut off, but so was the cradle's connection to the station's life support. Juno, Kalen roared, grabbing a portable oxygen canister. Manual override, now! The next 10 minutes were a blur of frantic, desperate labor. Kalen and Juno worked like demons, bypassing the digital locks on the cradle with physical shunts. They were breathing hard, their lungs burning as the workshop's air began to thin. Lyra stood in the center of the chaos, her glow intensifying until it was a blinding white light. She was no longer just talking to Alara. She was acting as a lightning rod, drawing the chaotic resonance of the dying sector into herself so that the girl wouldn't be crushed by the psychic feedback. Kalen felt a sharp pain in his chest. Fear was telling him to run. Fear was telling him he had just killed his sister. But he kept his hands moving. He refused to listen. There, Juno shouted as a green light finally flickered on the cradle's manual panel. Oxygen at 90%. Internal battery engaged. We've got 2 hours of juice, Voss. That's it. Kalen slumped against the cradle, his forehead resting on the cold glass. He was trembling so hard he could barely stand. You did it, Lyra said, her voice sounding faint. I almost gave you up, Kalen whispered, not looking at her. I almost said yes. But you didn't, she replied. Courage isn't the absence of that thought, Kalen. It's the fact that you let the thought pass and kept your hands on the tools. The moment of peace was shattered by a heavy metallic thud against the workshop's outer door. Then another, the sound of hydraulic rams. The wardens had arrived. They aren't going to wait for the air to run out, Juno said, checking her rifle. They're coming in the front door. We can't stay here, Kalen said, his engineer's mind already mapping the vents. We need to get to the central hub. If Thorn is using the dirge crystals to control the signal, we have to find the source. We have to show the station what he's doing. With Ilara? Juno asked, gesturing to the heavy immobile cradle. We can't carry that through the vents. We don't have to, Kalen said, looking at the cargo lift in the floor. We're going down further, into the sublayers, into the loom. The sublayers of Aetherius spires were a place that didn't exist on any public map. This was the gut of the station, where the massive gravity wells were housed and where the raw data of 10 million lives was processed. It was a forest of black cables, some as thick as trees, pulsing with a faint, rhythmic violet light. Kalen, Juno, and Lyra pushed the heavy Cortex cradle on a mag sled, moving through the shadows of the massive server stacks. The air here was freezing, chilled by the massive cryogenic units required to keep the station's brain from melting. Lyra was silent, her glow dimmed to a low, mournful pulse. As they approached the center of the sublayer, she began to shiver. "It's so loud here," she whispered. "I don't hear anything," Juno said, her eyes darting around the dark corners. "Rifle ready." "It's not a sound," Lyra said. "It's a weight. The loom, it's not just a computer. It's a cage of 1 billion echoes." They reached a massive, circular chamber. In the center was a structure that defied Kalen's understanding of engineering. It was a tower of translucent tubes, filled with a shimmering, bioluminescent fluid. Inside the fluid, thousands of delicate fiber optic threads moved like the tentacles of a deep-sea creature. "The loom," Kalen breathed. He moved toward a maintenance terminal at the base of the tower. His fingers flew across the holographic keyboard, bypass codes he had spent years memorizing for emergencies, clicking into place. "I need to find the connection to Sector 88, Kalen said. "I need to prove Thorn rigged the life support. If I can broadcast the logs to the entire station—" He stopped. His hands froze on the keys. "Voss? What is it?" Juno asked. Kalen stared at the data scrolling across the screen. It wasn't just maintenance logs. It was a project file. Project Stardust. He opened the file, his heart sinking into his stomach. Images began to flicker on the screen. Not images of machines, but of children. Human children. Their faces were hollow, their eyes vacant. Each of them had a neural interface grafted into the base of their skull. "What is this?" Juno whispered, her voice trembling. "Thorn wasn't just using the Glimmerkin," Kalen said, his voice sounding dead. "He was trying to replicate them. He wanted a resonator that was easier to control. A human one." He scrolled down. He saw a date. 12 years ago. A list of failed specimens. And then he saw the name. Specimen 49 Alpha. Name: Elara Voss. Status: non-viable. Cognitive rejection of harmonization signal. Disposition: released to civilian sector for observation of degenerative effects. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Kalen felt the world around him shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces. Every memory he had of Elara, her birth, her first steps, the day she got sick, it was all a lie. She hadn't been born to his parents. She had been a lab-grown prototype, discarded and left for him to find and raise, a biological experiment hidden in plain sight. "She's not my sister," Kalen whispered, the words tasting like ash. "I've spent my whole life. I've sacrificed everything for a failed corporate project." He turned toward the cradle, his eyes filled with a sudden, sharp betrayal. He saw the girl lying there, and for a second she looked like a stranger, a piece of hardware, a Titan's crumb. Lyra walked over to him. She didn't look at the screen. She looked at him. "Is she?" she asked softly. Kalen looked up, his jaw tight. "Look at the data, Lyra. She's a specimen. She was designed in a tube to be an antenna for a madman." Lyra reached out and grabbed his hand. Her glow was warm, almost hot. "I was designed to be an antenna too, Kalen," she said. "My people were bred for it by the stars, and then harvested by Thorn. Does that make me a machine? Does that make my fear less real? Does it make the way I feel when I look at you a calculation?" Kalen looked at her, then back at the cradle. "She didn't choose to be born in a lab," Lyra continued. "But you chose to raise her. You chose to protect her. You chose to work 3 shifts in the grease pits so she could have air. Thorn made her body, Kalen, but you made her Elara." Kalen looked at the girl in the cradle. He remembered the night he stayed up for 40 hours straight, hand-cranking a manual pump when the sector's power failed, just so she could breathe. He remembered the way she used to hold his thumb when she was a baby. The lab didn't do that. Thorn didn't do that. He did. Family isn't about the blood in the tubes, Kalen thought. It's about the choice to stay when everyone else walks away. I'm still her brother, Kalen said, his voice coming back, stronger than before. Lab or no lab, she's mine. He turned back to the terminal, his eyes burning with a new kind of rage. He didn't just want to prove Thorne rigged the air. He wanted to burn the loom to the ground. Voss, we've got a problem, Juno said, pointing toward the entrance of the chamber. The violet light in the cables was changing. It was turning into a harsh, aggressive red. The loom was reacting to their presence. Above them, the massive ceiling of the chamber began to iris open. A platform descended, glowing with a soft, expensive light. Standing on the platform was Valerius Thorne. He wasn't wearing a silk suit anymore. He was encased in a sleek, white exoskeleton that seemed to hum with the same frequency as the station. I had hoped it wouldn't come to this, Thorne said, his voice echoing in the chamber. I had hoped you would be satisfied with the credits and the lie. But you had to look beneath the floorboards, didn't you, Mr. Voss? You're a monster, Thorne, Kalen spat, stepping in front of the cradle. Monster? Thorne smiled, a cold, empty expression. I am an architect. I am building a world without the discordance of human emotion. No more wars, no more poverty, no more hate. Just a perfect, harmonized symphony. Ilara was a necessary step. She was the first attempt to bridge the gap between the human brain and the station's frequency. She was a failure, yes, but her rejection of the signal provided the data I needed to perfect the Glimmerkin integration. He looked at Lyra. And now, the experiment is over. I will take back my asset, and I will dismantle the failed prototype. He raised his hand. The white exoskeleton hummed. The gravity in the room shifted. Kalen felt his feet leave the floor as the 1.5G spike hit. Juno was pinned to the wall, her rifle clattering to the floor. Lyra screamed as the loom's violet threads began to lash out like whips, drawn to her luminescence. Kalen struggled against the crushing weight of the gravity. His ribs felt like they were about to snap. He looked at Ilara, whose biometrics were flatlining as the loom began to drain the power from her cradle. Fear told him it was over. Fear told him a man with a wrench couldn't fight a man with a station. But Kalen Voss wasn't just a man with a wrench. He was a man who had made a choice. Juno, Kalen choked out. The cryogenic lines. The blue ones. Juno, pinned against the wall, looked toward a cluster of frost-covered pipes near her hand. She understood. She reached for a manual release valve, her muscles straining against the gravity. Thorne turned his attention toward her. You cannot stop the symphony, Sergeant Hale. I'm an engineer, Thorne, Juno gasped, her fingers closing around the valve. We don't stop symphonies. We cause feedback. She twisted the valve. A blast of liquid nitrogen erupted from the pipe. The room was instantly filled with a blinding white fog. The temperature plummeted. The loom's violet threads, designed for the warmth of biological data, shivered and froze, shattering like glass. The gravity spike failed. Kalen hit the floor hard, but he was already moving. He grabbed his heavy wrench and scrambled toward the base of the loom's central tower. Thorne roared in frustration, the white exoskeleton compensating for the cold as he stepped off the platform. But Kalen wasn't aiming for Thorne. He was aiming for the master dirge crystal, the one that synced the loom to the station's broadcast. Get Lyra to the terminal, Kalen shouted to Juno as he swung the wrench with every ounce of strength he had left. The wrench struck the crystal. The sound was like the universe cracking in half. The violet light in the chamber didn't die. It exploded. The explosion of the master dirge crystal was not a sound of fire and brimstone. It was a psychic shattering, a high-frequency scream that ripped through the cold air of the loom and echoed in the marrow of Kalen's bones. For a heartbeat, the entire sublayer of the Aetherius spires was bathed in a violent, strobing violet light. Then everything plunged into a terrifying, suffocating gray. Kalen was thrown back by the concussive force, his boots sliding across the frost-slicked floor. He felt a sharp metallic tang in his mouth and realized he had bitten his tongue. His ears were ringing, a dull, underwater drone that made his balance tilt. Through the haze of cryogenic fog, he saw Lyra. She was on her knees, her glow erratic, like a dying lantern in a storm. Lyra! Kalen's voice sounded far away, a ghostly rasp. He scrambled toward her, his hands slipping on the frozen cables. Behind them, the loom was groaning. The towers of shimmering fluid were vibrating with a dangerous, unstable frequency. Without the crystal to synchronize the data, the entire biological network was beginning to cannibalize itself. Juno was already at the mag sled, her pulse rifle smoking in her hands. She was frantically checking the connections on Alara's cradle. Voss, the feedback is frying the battery. If we don't move now, this whole chamber is going to become a microwave. Kaylin reached Lyra, grabbing her shoulders. She looked at him, her emerald eyes unfocused, tears of liquid light tracking down her shimmering cheeks. It's the silence, she whispered. The choir. It's screaming, Kaylin. It's all the pain they've been suppressing for years. It's coming back. The harmonization was breaking. Across the Aetherius spires, 10 million people were suddenly waking up from a 6-month emotional slumber. The artificial calm was evaporating, replaced by the raw, jagged reality of their lives. The hunger, the debt, the exhaustion. Valerius Thorn was still standing on his platform, though he looked less like an architect and more like a ghost. The white exoskeleton was sparking, the sleek plates covered in a layer of frost. He stared at the shattered crystal, his face a mask of disbelief. You broke the symphony, Thorn whispered, his voice amplified by the dying comms. You've unleashed the discord. Do you have any idea what you've done, Voss? You haven't freed them. You've given them back their suffering. Better to suffer and be real than to smile and be a machine. Kaylin spat, his hand closing around the handle of his mag sled. He didn't wait for Thorn to recover. He kicked the sled into motion, the heavy cradle hovering a few inches off the floor. Juno took point, her rifle scanning the dark corridors. They retreated into the labyrinth of the sublayers, leaving Thorn standing amidst the ruins of his dream. But Kaylin's victory felt like lead in his stomach. The words on the screen, Specimen 49 Alpha, were burned into his retinas. Every time he looked at the cradle, he felt a surge of a cold, poisonous doubt. He had risked everything for a girl who was a lab-grown prototype. He had murdered his own peace of mind for a corporate discard. They reached a maintenance elevator, a rusted cage that led to the transit hubs of Sector 88. Kaylin slammed the button, the winch screaming as it began to pull them upward. Voss, look at me, Juno said, her voice unusually soft. I'm fine, Juno. Watch the door. You're not fine. You're shaking. Kaylin ignored her. He stared at the floor. The elevator climbed through the layers of the station, the air becoming warmer, thicker, more familiar. But the silence between them was louder than the machinery. It's a lie, isn't it? Kaylin said, his voice a flat, dead thing. Everything. The way she looks, the way she breathes. It was all programmed. Thorn didn't just build a station. He built a family for me to keep me in line. A distraction. Kaylin, Lyra said, leaning against the side of the cage. She looked exhausted, her glow faded to a dim, bruised purple. A distraction doesn't fight the signal. A distraction doesn't have a soul that can choose to resist. She wasn't born, Lyra, Kaylin roared, his frustration finally boiling over. He slammed his fist against the metal wall of the elevator. She was assembled. Every time I felt bad for her, every time I worked myself to death to pay for her air, I was just servicing a piece of Thorn's hardware. Juno stepped forward, her hand landing heavy on Kaylin's arm. And what about the time she cried when you broke your leg in the turbines? Was that hardware? What about the drawing she made for you when she was 6? The one of the two of you sitting on the roof of the spire, looking at stars that don't exist. Was that programmed into her, Voss? Kaylin's breath hitched. He closed his eyes, seeing the drawing in his mind. It was a crude crayon smudge thing, but he had kept it in his pocket for 5 years. Thorn might have laid the foundations, Juno said, but you're the one who built the house. Don't let that monster take that away from you, too. The elevator shuddered to a halt. The doors hissed open, and they were hit by a wave of heat and sound. Sector 88 was in chaos. The citizens were pouring into the streets, their faces etched with confusion and sudden, sharp grief. Some were fighting, others were weeping openly. The dirge crystals in the walls were dark, their violet hum replaced by the raw, unedited noise of the slums. Kaylin pushed the cradle out into the workshop. It was empty, the airlocks hanging open. He felt a sudden, sharp spike of fear. Not for himself, but for the girl inside the pod. Is she still with us? Kalen asked, his anger forgotten as he checked the monitors. The battery was at 5%. The manual oxygen flow was stuttering. Alara's face was pale, her breathing shallow. She's slipping, Lyra said, her hand moving to the glass. The loom was her source, Kalen. When you broke the crystal, you cut her tether. She's falling into the dark. Kalen looked at the portable power cell. Empty. He looked at the workshop's main breaker. Dead. I can fix it, Kalen whispered, his hands already searching for a jumper cable. I can fix anything. But as he looked at the complex, failing systems of the cradle, he realized that for the first time in his life, a wrench wasn't enough. He was a mechanic in a world that needed a miracle, and he was terrified. The sound of the warden's boots on the metal catwalks outside the workshop was a rhythmic, terrifying countdown. They weren't coming for a social call. They were coming to incinerate the evidence of Thorne's failure. We have to go, Voss, Juno shouted, barricading the door with a heavy welding bench. If we stay here, we're trapped in a box. I'm not leaving her, Kalen shouted back, his hands buried in the wiring of the cradle's power converter. If I move her now, her heart will stop. He was sweating, the grease on his brow mixing with tears of pure, unadulterated frustration. He was a man of logic, of gears and grease, but nothing he knew could explain the crushing weight in his chest. He looked at Alara, the failed specimen, and all he saw was his sister, the girl who liked the smell of ozone, the girl who had been his only reason to breathe for a decade. Lyra walked to the center of the workshop. She stood under the single, flickering emergency light, her white robes stained with oil and frost. Her glow began to change. It wasn't a pulse anymore. It was a steady, radiating warmth that seemed to pull the shadows out of the corners. Kalen, she said, her voice echoing with a strange double-tone resonance. There is a way to wake her. How? I've tried the manual overrides, the bypasses. Not through the machine, Lyra said. Through the resonance. She looked at the small, scavenged dirge crystal shard that Kalen had kept on his bench. It was dark, inert, but it still held the memory of the station's frequency. Thorne used these to broadcast fear, Lyra said. But a frequency is just a carrier. It can carry anything. It can carry hate, or it can carry the truth. She picked up the shard. Her skin began to shimmer with a blinding golden intensity. Kalen, I need you to connect me to the cradle. Not through the software. Through the neural interface. Lyra, no, Kalen said, standing up. That'll burn you out. The feedback from her decay is too strong. You told me yourself, she's a war zone. If she wakes up, the station wakes up, Lyra said, her eyes fixed on Kalen's. She is the human counterpart to my signal. She is the bridge that Thorne couldn't build because he didn't understand the materials. He thought he needed a mind. He didn't realize he needed a heart. She stepped toward the cradle, the shard in her hand beginning to glow with a soft violet light. Do you trust me? She asked. Kalen looked at her. He thought about the restaurant, the glass floor, and the choice to leave the gold behind. He thought about the courage it took to be honest in a world built on lies. With my life, Kalen said. He reached for the neurocables, the fine silver threads that connected the cradle to the station's grid. With a steady hand, he spliced them, creating a direct bridge between Lyra's glowing palm and the ports behind Ilara's ears. The connection was instantaneous. A wave of pure white light erupted from the cradle, knocking Kalen and Juno back against the walls. The workshop was filled with a sound that wasn't a sound, a vibration that felt like every memory Kalen had ever had, played at once. He saw Alara as a baby. He saw her first smile. He saw the cold, sterile lab where she was made. He saw Thorne's face, twisted with clinical curiosity. And then he saw the truth. Alara wasn't failing because she couldn't handle the harmonization. She was failing because she was absorbing it. She was a sponge, soaking up all the suppressed grief and loneliness of the entire station, holding it all inside her small, fragile mind so that others wouldn't have to. She wasn't a failed antenna. She was a voluntary martyr. Lyra's glow was becoming translucent, her physical form beginning to blur. Her voice sounded like 1,000 people talking at once. Kalen. She's waking up, but she needs an anchor. She needs to know why she should come back. Kalen crawled toward the cradle, his muscles screaming. The gravity in the room was fluctuating wildly, the mag fields of the station reacting to the massive psychic discharge. He reached out and grabbed Alara's hand. It was cold, so cold. Alara, he whispered, his voice cracking. It's Kalen. It's your brother. He felt the fear, the massive, crushing fear of the 10 million souls on the station. He felt their despair, their anger, their hopelessness. It was a tide that threatened to drown him. It's a lie, the fear whispered in his head. You're just a grease monkey. You're nothing. You're alone. No, Kalen said, his grip on her hand tightening. He wasn't afraid of the truth anymore. He didn't care if she was a specimen or a sister. He didn't care if the world was a machine or a dream. I choose you, Kalen roared, his voice cutting through the psychic static. I don't care where you came from. You're mine. I'm the one who stays. He poured everything into that one thought. Not a grand speech, but the memory of a cracked coffee mug they shared, the smell of the rain in the hydroponic gardens, the weight of her head on his shoulder when she was tired. Small, banal, human things, the things Thorne could never calculate. The violet light of the shard began to change. It turned to a warm, vibrant amber. The screaming resonance of the station began to soften, to harmonize not with Thorne's artificial peace, but with Kalen's stubborn, messy love. In the cradle, Alara's eyes snapped open. They weren't the emerald of the Glimmerkin, nor the flat brown of a human. They were a mixture of both, a swirling golden amber that seemed to see everything at once. Kalen, she whispered. The white light imploded. The workshop went dark. For a long moment, there was only the sound of heavy breathing and the distant, fading alarms of the station. Then a soft, natural glow began to fill the room. Kalen looked up. Lyra was slumped against the wall, her fiber-optic hair dark, her skin a pale human gray. She was breathing, but she looked like she had aged 1,000 years in a second. And in the cradle, Alara was sitting up. She looked at her hands, then at the room, and finally at Kalen. You're loud, Kalen, she said, a small, shaky smile touching her lips. You always were. Kalen didn't say a word. He pulled her out of the cradle and held her so tight he thought she might break. He didn't care about Thorne. He didn't care about the wardens outside. He didn't care about the credits. He had chosen his family. And for the first time in his life, the fear was gone. The workshop door groaned. The wardens had finally broken through the barricade. They stepped into the room, their armored suits gleaming in the amber light. Their weapons were raised, their visors dark. Kalen stood up, placing himself in front of Lyra and Alara. He didn't have a rifle. He didn't have a shield. He only had his wrench and the truth. But as the wardens looked at Alara, something strange happened. They stopped, their weapons lowered, one by one. The amber light from her eyes was reflecting in their visors. And for the first time in their lives, they weren't seeing a target. They were seeing a person. The harmonization was over. The resonance of the truth had begun. Kalen Voss, the man who was paid to be a disappointment, stood in the center of the room. He was covered in grease, blood, and tears. He was a mess. He was a masterpiece. We're done fixing your station, Thorne, Kalen said to the hidden cameras. Now we're going to fix the people. The transformation had begun. It was painful, it was chaotic, and it was the most beautiful thing Kalen had ever seen. The amber light from Alara's eyes did not fade. It settled. It was no longer a blinding flash of psychic power, but a steady, resonant glow that seemed to seep into the very metal of the workshop walls. Outside, the world was ending, and yet it felt like it was finally beginning. The wardens, men who had been little more than polished chrome and lethality, stood paralyzed. One of them, a sergeant whose helmet had been cracked in the breach, slowly raised his hands to his face. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was touching the wetness on his cheeks. He stared at his fingers, at the tears he hadn't known he could shed, with a look of profound, terrified wonder. They're remembering, Lyra whispered. She was slumped against a stack of cooling units, her skin the color of ash, her fiber-optic hair limp and gray. She looked like a star that had spent all its fuel to light a single room. Kalen knelt beside her, keeping one hand firmly on Alara's shoulder. The girl was awake, sitting on the edge of the cradle, her gaze distant as if she were listening to a conversation happening miles away. Remembering what? Kalen asked. Everything, Alara said. Her voice was steady, lacking the tremor of a sick child. It had the weight of the station behind it. They're remembering the people they were told to forget. They're remembering that they were afraid before they were told to be brave. Kalen looked at the wardens. They were breathing in unison now, a rhythmic, heavy sound that matched the thrumming of the floorboards. The harmonization hadn't just made them obedient, it had made them numb. To Thorn, a man who didn't feel was a man who couldn't fail. But Kalen knew better. A man who couldn't feel was just a machine waiting to rust. Juno stepped toward the lead warden, her rifle lowered but her jaw tight. "Hey, you, can you hear me?" The warden looked at her. His eyes, visible through the cracked visor, were bloodshot and raw. My mother," he rasped. "She died in Sector 42. 3 years ago. I didn't go to the funeral. I was on duty. I felt nothing." He fell to his knees, the heavy armor clattering against the metal. "I didn't feel anything." The grief hit the room like a physical wave. It wasn't the artificial fear of Thorn's crystals. It was the messy, honest pain of a human life. It was heavy, and it was ugly, and it was the most beautiful thing Kalen had ever seen. "We have to go," Kalen said, standing up. The realization was hitting him now, the weight of what they had done. If the wardens are waking up, so is the rest of the station. 10 million people are feeling 3 years of suppressed grief all at once. "It'll be a riot," Juno said, looking at the monitors. "The lower spire is already screaming. If we don't stabilize the grid, they'll tear this place apart just to feel something different." "They won't," Alara said, standing up. She was small, her feet bare on the cold floor, but she moved with a grace that felt ancient. "They just need a new song." Kalen looked at her, his sister, the prototype, the girl he had raised in the dark. He saw the way she looked at Lyra, a silent communion passing between the two biological resonators. He saw that they were two sides of a bridge, one alien, one human, both forged in the fire of Thorn's ambition. "The high spire," Lyra said, reaching out to take Kalen's hand. Her grip was weak, but her touch still sparked with that strange, comforting resonance. "Thorn is still in the central hub. He has the master overrides. He can still vent the atmosphere. He can still reset the station by killing everyone who woke up." "Then we finish it," Kalen said. They moved through the corridors of Sector 88, but the world had changed. There were no sirens, no shouted orders. Instead, there was a strange, haunting silence, broken only by the sound of weeping and the low, rhythmic thudding of people hitting the walls. Not in anger, but in a desperate need for tactile reality. In the transit hub, they found Dr. Eris. The old doctor was kneeling in the middle of a crowd of dock workers, his hands covered in blood, but his face was calm. He was holding the hand of a man who was convulsing with psychic shock. "Voss!" Eris shouted as they passed. "You did it! The signal! It's gone!" "It's not gone, Doc," Kalen shouted back. "It's just honest now. Keep them breathing." They reached the private elevator to the high spire. It was a sleek, needle-like tube of glass that bypassed the layers of the station. Kalen looked at the controls. Locked. Encrypted with a Thorn Dynamics master key. Kalen didn't reach for a data prism. He reached into his tool belt and pulled out his heavy hydro spanner. "I'm tired of keys," Kalen said. He jammed the spanner into the service panel and wrenched it open. With a shower of sparks, he bypassed the digital security by physically shorting the mag rails. He wasn't hacking, he was forcing the machine to obey. The elevator groaned, the glass tube vibrating as it began its long, vertical climb toward the apex. As they rose, the storms of Vexus 9 became visible again. But they looked different now. They didn't look like velvet ripples. They looked like a war. Kalen looked at Alara, who was staring at her own reflection in the glass. "Do you hate me?" he asked, the question he had been terrified to voice since the loom. "For not being your real brother? For being part of the lie?" Alara turned to him. Her eyes were no longer amber. They were a soft, clear brown, but the light stayed behind them. "You didn't fix the pipes because Thorn told you to, Kalen," she said. "You fixed them because you didn't want the people to die. You didn't raise me because of a lab report. You raised me because I was small and I was yours." She reached out and touched his grease-stained cheek. "Thorn made the specimen. You made the brother. I don't care about the blueprint. I like the house." Kalen felt a lump in his throat that no tool could remove. He realized then that his fear had been his greatest lie. He had been afraid that his value was tied to his blood, his status, his credits. But the only value that mattered was the one he had created with his own two hands and a stubborn, irrational heart. The elevator slowed. The doors opened onto the high spire's central sanctuary, a cathedral of glass and white marble. Valerius Thorn was waiting for them. The sanctuary was silent, a vast circular space that felt more like a tomb than a seat of power. Valerius Thorn stood at the central console, his back to them. He was still wearing the white exoskeleton, but it was battered, the sleek plates hanging loose like the scales of a dying fish. He didn't turn around. He was staring at a holographic map of the station. It was bleeding red. "Look at it," Thorn said, his voice a dry, hollow echo. "The chaos, the entropy. In 3 hours, the productivity of Aethera spires has dropped to zero. The social fabric is shredding. People are refusing to work. They are mourning children who died years ago. They are remembering debts they cannot pay. You haven't freed them, Mr. Voss. You've paralyzed them with the weight of their own failures." "I've given them back their lives," Kalen said, stepping forward. "The failures are part of the package, Thorn. You can't have the light without the shadows." Thorn turned. His face was pale, his eyes sunken and bright with a feverish intensity. He looked like a man who had stared into the sun for too long and was now trying to describe the dark. "I offered them perfection," Thorn roared, slamming a fist onto the console. "I offered them a world where no one was ever truly alone, where every heart beat in sync, and you, a man who spends his life in the sewers, you decided that your small, pathetic feelings were more important than the stability of a civilization? My pathetic feelings are the only reason this station is still standing," Kalen said, his voice steady. "Because I'm the one who fixed the leaks you ignored. I'm the one who stayed when the sirens went off. You didn't build a civilization, Thorn. You built a clock. And clocks don't live. They just count down until they stop." Thorn smiled, a jagged, terrifying expression. "Then let us stop the count." He reached for the master override, a physical lever encased in a secondary glass shield. The purge. If he pulled it, the magnetic containment fields for the station's atmosphere would collapse. The Aethera spires would become a hollow bone in the vacuum of space. "I will not rule a ruin," Thorn whispered, "but I will not allow a glitch to survive." Juno raised her rifle, but Thorn was too fast. A wave of kinetic energy from the exoskeleton's emitters sent her flying across the room. Lyra tried to step forward, but she was too weak, collapsing to her knees as the ambient frequency of the room began to scream. Kalen didn't run for Thorn. He didn't reach for a weapon. He looked at the console. He looked at the miles of wiring, the complex junctions, the cascading layers of data that Thorn was using to hold the station hostage. He saw the structure. He saw the flaws. "Ilara!" Kalen shouted. "The resonance! Now!" Ilara stepped into the center of the room. She didn't look at Thorn. She looked at the floor, at the invisible lines of power that ran beneath the marble. She reached out with her mind, not to attack, but to listen. She found the heartbeat of the station. She found the rhythmic pulse of the life support, the heavy thud of the gravity wells, the low, steady hum of the oxygen scrubbers. And then she found the note, the one clear, soaring note of the truth. She began to sing. It wasn't a sound of the throat. It was a broadcast of the soul. The amber light from her eyes flooded the sanctuary, entwining with the violet threads of the loom's terminal. Thorn grabbed the lever. He pulled with all his strength. Nothing happened. The lever didn't move. The software didn't respond. The station's central brain was no longer listening to Valerius Thorn. It was listening to the girl who had been raised in the grease pits. It was listening to the heart that had been forged in the dark. The exoskeleton began to whine, the white plates vibrating until they shattered. Thorn was thrown back from the console, his body hitting the glass wall of the sanctuary. He slumped to the floor, a broken man in a broken suit, watching as his empire dissolved into a golden, human light. It's not logical," Thorn whispered, staring at Ilara. "No," Kalen said, walking over to the console and placing his hand on the terminal. "It's engineering. If you don't account for the soul in the blueprints, the building won't hold. Kalen didn't kill him. He didn't need to. He simply deactivated the master override and initiated a global system restore. He wiped the harmonization algorithm from the servers, deleting every line of code Thorne had written. The station shuddered. The red lights on the map turned to a soft, steady green. It was over. A week later, the Aetheris spires looked the same from the outside. It was still a halo of titanium and diamond glass suspended against the violet storms of Vexus 9. But the air was different. It didn't smell like patented lavender. It smelled of recycled oxygen and cooking oil and people. It smelled like life. Kalen sat on a maintenance gantry in Sector 88, his legs dangling over the bustling transit hub below. He was wearing his old jumpsuit, the one with the grease stains that would never come out. Beside him sat Lyra. Her skin was still pale, her glow a gentle, permanent amber, but she looked at peace. She was no longer a ward. She was the station's first free agent diplomat. "And Alara?" Lyra asked. "She's at the clinic with Eris," Kalen said, a small smile touching his lips. "She's helping the victims of the reawakening. It turns out when you can feel everyone's pain, you're pretty good at fixing it. And you, Kalen Voss? What will you do now? The council offered you a seat in the High Spire. They want you to head the new infrastructure department." Kalen looked at his wrench, lying on the gantry beside him. He looked at the scarred skin of his hands, the hands that had fixed a sister and broken a titan. "I think I'll stay down here for a while," Kalen said. "There are still a lot of pipes that need fixing. And besides, someone has to make sure the High Spire doesn't forget where its air comes from." He leaned back, looking up through the layers of the station toward the distant flickering stars. "I used to think my life was measured in credits and atmospheric pressure. I was a man of the shadows, a mechanic who apologized for the grease on his hands because I thought it made me less than the people who lived in the light. I spent 10 years terrified that if I failed, if I broke, if I made a mistake, the world would realize I was nothing. I thought courage was a luxury for people with full stomachs and clear consciences. But standing on that glass floor, looking into the eyes of a woman who was a star and a girl who was a miracle, I realized that I had the blueprints upside down. The grease isn't a stain, it's proof that I was there, that I fought, that I kept things running when the world wanted them to stop. My flaws didn't make me a failure. They made me the only one capable of fixing the machine. I wasn't a specimen, and I wasn't a hero. I was a man who chose to love something that wasn't viable. I was a man who chose to be a brother when the universe told me I was just a contractor. We are all built from fragments, scavenged memories, borrowed hopes, and the stubborn debris of our failures. But it's not the materials that matter. It's the hand that holds the wrench. It's the heart that decides which parts are worth keeping. I spent so long running from the parts of myself I thought were broken, only to find they were exactly what the world needed. I wonder, if you looked at your own flaws, not as mistakes in the blueprint, but as the very things that give you the strength to stand, what would you finally stop trying to fix and start trying to use? Kalen Voss picked up his wrench, the metal cool and solid in his grip, and began his walk back into the dark, humming heart of the station. He wasn't working for the credits anymore. He was working for the song.